Do we know the authors of the New Testament? Wow. Well, we actually do have good reasons to believe that we know the authors of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts as well. Now, a common criticism is that we don't have the original manuscripts, and those original manuscripts didn't even have names on them. And so someone like Bart Ehrman, for example, a bona fide, legitimate New Testament scholar, might say, look, we can't have any confidence in who the New Testament authors really were because those names were attributed later by the church fathers 100 years after they were written. And so all we have is their testimony, but their testimony is far too late. So we can't really know who the authors were.
Yeah.
And by the way, those names like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attributed to the New Testament authors because they were anonymous originally. And what we needed was to put credible names to these gospels so that people would believe them as true. So we used Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John because they're credible names, and that somehow shores up the credibility. They would also argue that the New Testament is written in a high Greek form, and therefore these sort of unlettered and illiterate fishermen probably didn't really write those things. So there's no reason to believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the ones who wrote it. The problem with that is that, one, it's ad hoc. We have great reasons to believe that the original manuscripts did have attribution to them. Ancient documents did have names or some kind of a tag or identifying marker in the manuscript about who wrote the thing. Now, we don't have the original Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We just simply don't have that. What we have is great copies and early copies of those documents. Just much like we don't have the original Quran, for example, or the original Upanishads or whatever, we have copies of those things. Well, in the copies, we have attribution to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we have the church fathers, the early church fathers, from Clement to Papias to you name it, who actually said that these books, this is Matthew's gospel, this is Luke's gospel, this is Mark's gospel, this is from John. And Luke wrote not only Luke, but also the book of Acts. So we have this church father tradition, but it's also based on the fact that every other ancient document in ancient history actually has attribution to who wrote it. In fact, that's what Brant Petrie makes the point of, is that ancient manuscripts always had something that attributed the authorship to the person who wrote the document. So there's no reason to believe that the original Testament didn't have it. In fact, this is what he says. There is absolutely no manuscript evidence, and thus no actual historical evidence to support the claim that originally the Gospels had no titles. He's saying there's no reason to believe they didn't have titles. And so the titles that are given to it by the early church are likely the titles that they actually had when they were written. Craig Evans, another New Testament scholar, he says that there are really no anonymous copies of the Gospels. The copies aren't anonymous, and the originals probably aren't. So he says this, unless evidence of the contrary should surface, we should stop talking about anonymous gospels and late unhistorical superscriptions and subscriptions. He's saying, you're not providing evidence, you're providing supposition. So when someone says we don't know who the authors were, they're not basing it on evidence that the authors were different. They're saying, we need more evidence. Well, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that we know who they are. Not only that, but there's also an issue with the literacy argument. Them saying, well, the New Testament was written in this high Greek form, and the New Testament writers were all sort of these bumpkins who didn't know how to write high Greek. One is that anybody who studies actual New Testament Greek will tell you that Koine Greek and the grammar in much of the New Testament isn't considered super high sophisticated Greek. It was Greek that was accessible to everyone, and it did in fact have some unconventional grammar throughout it because it was written by people who weren't sort of the highfalutin, high language people as well. And they also didn't speak Greek as their first language. It was likely translated from either Aramaic or Hebrew into Greek as well. So you're going to have a translation issue. Second thing is that let's assume for a moment that they didn't speak a high form of Greek. It was very common in ancient days to have a scribe. So you would dictate your letter to someone, and the scribe would write it down. So even if they were, quote unquote, illiterate, and that word means a lot of different things, they easily could have spoken those words, and their scribe would have written it down. In fact, many people believe that that's what Mark's gospel actually is, that it's not the gospel according to Mark. It's actually mostly the gospel according to Peter, and Mark was the one who wrote it down and did some ancillary investigation into the eyewitness accounts.
Wow.
And that's why you have language like "and immediately" and "then right away" and all these, because Peter's that kind of a guy.
Yeah.
You can see Peter's personality all in the Gospel of Mark. So the illiteracy thing doesn't really hold water
Sure.
in that sense. And then there's the issue of the attribution of the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to the Gospels because of a credibility issue, that somehow those names gave credibility to anonymous sources. The reality is, if you were to pick names who would be the most credible
Yeah.
to give a false sense of credibility to those Gospels, you wouldn't pick Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Matthew was a tax collector, and his writings were to Jews. Would you take a tax collector, someone who's considered a traitor to the Jews, and say, we should make that guy the author?
great point.
That seems like an unlikely thing.
Yeah.
Mark was basically a secondary figure in the early church as well. So his name wouldn't be the kind of name you would put. You would put Peter's name on it. Why would you put Mark? And Luke was an original disciple. He was a companion of Paul's.
Yeah.
Why would you include Paul's name on there? The only one you could think of to put on his credibility would be John, and we have great reasons to believe that John was actually the author of the Gospel of John. So that argument also falls by the wayside. In the end, what we have great evidence to believe that the original manuscripts probably did have the names on them,
Yeah.
that the church fathers were right in keeping that tradition alive, and that none of the so-called evidence against the authorship of the New Testament holds any kind of water.